Here's this really interesting thing that is happening in astrology at the moment. There's a transformation of the thought process that's going on in the astrological world. It's kind of glacial, it's very slow, it's been happening for several decades, but it's relatively new on the time span, on the historical time span of astrology throughout human history. And it's really interesting because it kind of mirrors what is happening in the changes of ordinary thinking with people around the world. And you can see this mirrored in a number of ways. And this is what is happening, is that we are beginning to re-adopt a more traditional, ancient mode of consciousness. We are merging an older mode of consciousness into the newer mode and putting them together. And this is a process that has not happened before. We have a modern way of thinking, and you'll recognize it instantly when I start talking about it, because it's something that we all kind of inherently have within us. It's reflective of everything from manifestation to prosperity gospel. It's a change of how we are thinking about our place in the world. I can explain this much more effectively if we look at the history of astrology. So, the reason why you have a modernist movement in astrology at all is because we have gone through these traditional periods, like the ancient Babylonian, Mesopotamian periods, into the Greek Hellenistic periods, and into the medieval periods, the Islamic Caliphate periods. And then, because the transmission of information moved away from centralized places in Europe and went into the Islamic world and was developed there, when those things fell away, the information transmission between the Islamic world and the Western world fell to pieces. The Western world never retained its tradition of astrology. It started to lose it. And so it lost a lot of information. And what happened is that around the time of the discovery of the planet Uranus, people began to explore astrology in a new way, because here's a new planet. And how do we place it into all of these things? But they didn't have that traditional context as intact as an oral tradition passed from teacher to student. It was not intact in that way. So they had to reapproach it from dry textual basis, by reading the text, by reading the originals. And they didn't quite get everything that you might get from a transmission. And they also came down information from, what did survive of oral transmission and teacher to student transmission. I'm saying the word transmission a lot. I'm hoping that this is transmitting to you this information. And traditional astrology and modern astrology differ in the same exact way that traditional consciousness and modern consciousness differs. It's the same thing. The way that traditional people thought became the structure of traditional astrology, and the way that modern people thought became the structure of modern astrology. And remember, these astrologers, these modern astrologers are working in a very different time, a time of revolution, which was an unthinkable concept in the traditional world. We had, after the discovery of Uranus, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, all these revolutions of independence away from the monarchies and autocratic government structures that had governed humanity for thousands of years. We started to break away from that during and around the time of the discovery of Uranus. So this is the emergence of modernist thinking that occurs from this process. You go back to the ancient traditional mode of thinking. We don't have those planets. We don't have an escape from the autocracy. We are ruled people. We are ruled by these monarchies, which have been in place for thousands of years. Like, invite yourself to come into this mode of thinking. Robert Anton Wilson used to talk about putting on reality tunnels of ideological viewpoints so that you can change the way that you look at the world, and you can think of like a pair of binoculars, putting on a new lens, taking off your modernist lens for a moment and putting on the traditional lens and seeing what the world looks like through that. And it's helpful. No coincidence at all that the Odyssey is now, popular. And we're starting to see people gravitate to something in that movie. It's speaking to them about the nature of fatedness and being allotted certain fortunes by the gods. That's what this movie is all about. I mean, literally the plot of lots. What is your allotment? Is throughout that movie. It's a redemption arc, or a failure arc of one of the characters, who fails to redeem himself because of his allotment in life. You go back to this ancient mode of thinking, and the astrological mode of thinking, and you have to place yourself in an environment where the government that you live in is not separable from the religious environment and the cultural environment. It is the apex of the cultural religious environment in which you live, and therefore it is an absolute structure that you recognize and live with. And you have to place your life into the context of what's happening around you already. This is a world of mortal danger, around every corner. You carry weaponry in order to protect yourself from fate and fortune that might happen, that you might encounter along the road. If you're traveling in an ancient world, you don't know what you might encounter. You're more in the wild than you could ever be here in the modern world. You're more into the chaotic environment. You're subjected to weather more. You don't have as much control or understanding of the world around you. You have to answer to superiors because there are greater forces than you that can subjugate you, including armies and the forces of kingdoms, political forces, people who come to literally coerce you into obedience to that system. That's what the original system of taxation is. It's physically enforced. In the ancient world, as you are existent in it, you are subjected to things. You are a subject. It's much more fated and controlled. And you go, yeah, and that's also the way we are. We are kind of subjected. But we also believe here in our modern world that we are capable in some way of changing our fate if we so chose. And we believe in things like manifestation. We do exercise, we do yoga, we do meditations, we do prayers. Even in our spiritual lives, if we have very traditional spiritual lives, you might encounter theologies that are about benefiting the righteous in certain ways, like I talked about prosperity gospel. Prosperity gospel is about, if you are living in a righteous way, you are entitled to not be subjected to the conditions of the world quite as much. You manifest greater things for yourself. You manifest bounty and abundance. Abundance is perhaps the one word that truly defines the modern period from the traditional period. Traditional world is one of scarcity. Where does the food come from today? We are much more tied into the crops in the ancient world. When do crops develop? What is the cycle of crop? I'm not really well in tuned. I have very little earth energy, but so I can't speak to it very effectively. But the cycle of crops, when to plant, when to till, when to maintain and irrigate, and all these different things. In the ancient world, everyone is tied into this process, whereas we in the modern world are very divorced from the process of our crops. We sometimes can't even conceptualize that meat comes from animals. Children today don't know sometimes that meat comes from animals, or where this food comes from, or that we're eating things out of season. We eat strawberries year round. That's crazy talk to a traditional mindset that has to wait for the conditions of a strawberry to ripen and develop and be correct. You may not even see a strawberry in your lifetime. It could be a fantastical concept to you that's only eaten by royalty. There's that sort of food. And you can see the inherent privilege, therefore, of wealth and power. It's a very strict, definitive boundary that exists because of that scarcity. They're able to pull that in for themselves. There's more bounty, there's more abundance in our world. We are all here in America in air-conditioned buildings, eating food that that is not really tied to seasonality. We can go to McDonald's any moment. Our homeless have cell phones. Not to disparage them, but that is the reality of things that we live in. That's not the case in the ancient world. And so that gives us, in this modern world, a sense of our own capacity, a sense that we can shape our trajectory of our lives more so than other people. We're connected to things and our personal power in a way that traditional lives and consciousness was not. They are much more, they ask themselves, to what am I subject? And how do I deal with it? This is why the concept of the gods control your fate in the ancient world comes from. It's because this externality has so much more influence over you than in the modern world. But they can't conceive of that modern world. They simply live in this environment in which they are allotted fate by the gods. And so that's a very different mode of thinking. And this, if you trace the history of astrology through time, and you go through the loss of information and knowledge that happened in the European medieval period, that then leads into the Enlightenment period, where these things begin to be, astrology really disappears in the Enlightenment period, the beginning of the Enlightenment period, from the West entirely. It's only after the Enlightenment period and towards the industrialization period that it reemerges. So it's after much of the work of discovering Uranus has already occurred, and some integration of it through the mystery schools of the West. They integrate Uranus into the process of understanding astrology, and so it gets ascribed to different signs. Aquarius, Uranus in modern astrology is said to rule Aquarius, but traditionalists disdain this concept because Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, and it's only through a modern context that we would think that there is some sort of like breaking through revolutionary quality to both Uranus and Aquarius, because in Aquarius, in the traditional mode of thinking, it does not represent that necessarily. It's more of an outcast kind of vibe to it. It's a marginal. It's beyond Capricorn, which is the system. It's beyond that. It's marginal to the system. So a lot of differentiations between the way that modern thinking and traditional thinking is, and trying to trace that through history. You get to the industrial period, and you get to this emergence of this kind of new multiplicity that's happening in society. There's so much developing at any given time. There's so much opportunity. The new world has been discovered. We move to a land of opportunity, and we can make of ourselves what we will. This departs entirely from traditional thinking, and that modality of thought is placed into how the modernist viewed astrology. And then you discover Neptune, and Neptune becomes the ruler of Pisces in modern thought. It's traditionally Jupiter. And then we discover in the 1930s Pluto, and that gets ascribed to Scorpio, which is Mars in traditional rulership. And we go through this process because within the new age of the 20th century, new age astrology emerges, where we attempt to understand the discovery of these outer planets. How can the discovery of new planets not change astrology in some way? It has to, because we have to address reality, and the reality is that there's more planets than we conceived of. And what does that mean? And we may disagree with how modernists placed those planets into context, but we can't dismiss the action because they had to be re-understood. They understood those planets and put it in the context of the previous planets, of having rulership and having exaltations and whatever, and having some correspondence with signs. And they also thought there was correspondence to houses. But they're placing it, a new discovery, in the context of the old framing. And this is a concept that McLuhan talks about often, is how new discoveries can only be contextualized in the framework of older ideas and older thought structures, older forms. And you can see that in the transition between Saturn to Uranus. Uranus is the further planet away, away from the sun. Okay, so you have the sun, you have Mercury, you have Venus, you have the moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. This represents a process of development, of bringing things together, of structure that forms Saturn, that then creates the system of reality, the structure of reality itself. And then you depart from that and you come to Uranus. And Uranus is a weird sideways 90-degree planet out there in space, and it represents a departure from structure, from the system. And it also seems to rule over, and therefore it gives a structure to modern thinking, modern thought. We're disrupted. And so here come these new planets, and we have to contextualize them. And we can only do that, even though the context, the structure has been exploded, we now find the margins of it. We move past it. In some way, we still only have the structure itself to weigh itself against, to weigh these new discoveries against. That's what Uranus really represents in its discovery. And then you have these other planets that have to be put into their context. And what do they mean now? And then you have that happening in the middle of this new age psychedelic revival that is happening. Terence McKenna called it the archaic revival. It was a revival of an archaic mode of thinking, because the hippies wanted to return to the earth, wanted to disband the system. They wanted to reject it, to let it die. That's a very Plutonian mode. They wanted to transmute it into something new. It's a very Plutonian concept. And that was the archaic revival. And now we're still seeing, that was in the 1960s, we're still seeing the ramifications of that as it developed cyclically, a 30-year cycle, into the 90s, which became literally a traditionalist revival in the astrological world. Because what we had happening is Project Hindsight, that with Chris Brennan and Alan White and all of these different people, who I can't remember all of them all right now. It'll come to me. All of these people wanted to rediscover, go back to and rediscover and revitalize tradition in astrology. So even though which hadn't been practiced for a couple of hundred years, because we had been living in the Western world in this modernist environment, where now we had reascribed the newly discovered planets to different signs. We had done all kinds of crazy things in this modernist world. So they recognized that and wanted to go back to the original text, retranslate it, and give it a new life. Although it had been happening all along, this was a more concentrated effort. And it became, because it coincided with the development of computers and the development of social media and YouTube, this became popularized in a new way, this traditional movement, back to thinking about astrology in the modality that the ancient world originally gave us. But you see how that can't necessarily happen cleanly. You can't go back to the traditional mode of thinking when you have the modernist framework. Again, we're back in McLuhan's frames. We have the current system that Project Hindsight and these people came to address the traditional text in. They came from a modern framework inherently in their thinking, in their mode of thinking. It's just inherent to their modality. And so they're examining traditional astrology inherently through a modernist framework. It's a merging of the two that now emerges as a synergy that we are now living in a cycle, another 30-year cycle from. Our role now is to kind of merge these two. We have both the fated allotment of traditional astrology, what you are given, what you are subjected to, and then the modern astrology, modern mindset, the new age mindset of how do we transcend the previous system. And that's the work that is happening now. And it means recontextualizing, stepping away from the ways that we had contextualized things before, being able to step away from what we thought Uranus was, what we thought it ruled, and allowing ourselves to transcend all of these different boundaries. What if there is no such thing as rulership? What if we're seeing an illusion, a holographic illusion of rulership that's emerging from the compiling of the chart itself into the human mind? There's all sorts of radical concepts that can be approached now because we have a new emergent context, a new quantum context new quantum computational context that's emerging. That is a departure even from modernist thought. And now we're bringing in this multiplicity into astrology. We're bringing in entirely new concepts, asteroids. We're bringing in much more points we've got the Lilith point. We've got maybe that's it. We have a lot more newer things that are happening. The asteroid's probably one of the biggest things. Dwarf planets integrating those. There's a lot more to integrate now, and the multiplicity of that is very representative of this new complex post-modernist world that we now find ourselves in. That is a summation of traditional thinking, the having the character of ourselves being subjected to the world, and having our allotment in life, and having to figure out how to best live within those constraints. And modernist thinking, which becomes aware of those constraints and then moves past them, whether that's through a manifestation modality, a healing modality, a psychological modality, therapy, plant medicine, whatever. We are addressing ways to move past our own constraints. The postmodern thought says we can't ignore the ways in which we are constrained, because we are still subjected to the world. And things like these massive transnational corporations, climate change, the emergence of surveillance society is subjecting us now to these forms of things that we had not been subjected to before. And we see people rejecting this in a lot of ways. Ironically, the people who most claim to be traditional right now, conservatives, are rejecting that they must be subject to things greater than themselves, subject to information, subject to knowledge, subject to climate change, that these things are forcing us to address our living conditions and live within constraint. It's difficult. We're now seeing the reemergence of the gods, in a sense, with the emergence of AI, the emergence of large transnational corporations that essentially control huge aspects of our lives. We are now subject again in a way that the modernist world was not. There was the Enlightenment period was characterized by the call for civil liberties, for classical liberties to emerge, that we restricted government, we restricted things that infringed upon our rights, and we upheld this religiously by upholding the Constitution, constitutional values. We upheld our freedom, our personal responsibility, our capacity to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. These are conservative ideas. And now we're running into the limits of those concepts, which is now being addressed by the collective. The collective itself is becoming a limitation to the ideals that we thought. And I saw this happening. We started to articulate around the time of 9/11. We started to articulate that we were no longer interested in upholding our civil liberties, and we were more interested in upholding our security and making sure we stayed alive. We were more subject. We were recognizing that we were subject sometimes to forces beyond our control. We were attacked. This country was attacked, and then we tightened down restrictions on freedoms in order to protect ourselves from these future attacks and future things that were beyond our control. We attempted to control them. Our attempt to control our risk ended up creating a new gods that we were then subjected to. And we have given up even the call to civil liberties in the same way. classical liberalism is dying, because if I said it is more important to uphold our liberty, our freedom, than it is to uphold our safety, a lot of people would reject that premise. It's and say that of course, our survival, our safety, our existence is more primary than our liberties. This mode of thinking is the return of an ancient mode of thought coming back into our consciousness again. We have to address our lives in those two halves, those two wholes. What are we subjected to? What is it beyond our control, and what is within our control, and how can we manifest our best lives within that containment? And astrology can now tell us that more accurately.